We have calling from Texas, Alfred Pranzrahim wants to talk about Luke 16:17. How you doing, Alfred?
Gentlemen, I know you guys are pretty hostile to the teachings and practices of a guy who I think it's safe to say was generally a pretty righteous person, but it's fair. I mean, not fair. There are some fair criticisms of him.
Hey,
Um,
Alfred,
yes,
I'm sorry to do this. Your audio is kind of it seems to be kind of dropping. So I don't know if you're on a cell phone or a headset or whatever else, but it's very
is
difficult
it
to
cutting
hear
out
some of
or is
it.
it
It was dipping down to where it was almost cutting out or lower or whatever else, but I can hear you now. I just wanted to let you know that because there's an audio issue, we may have to ask you to clarify things a couple times. So
Yeah, just stay
anyway,
close to the
you
sure?
mic.
you say we're hostile to somebody you liked. I'm gonna just assume it's Jesus, but what's the point?
Well, there's a talking point I've heard on this program very often, and it's you guys will often cite Matthew 5:18, where Jesus says, "Not the tiniest pen stroke of the law will become void." It's also actually in Luke 16:17. It's
Yeah, I'm
you
aware.
saying, "I prefer." Okay. Um, and like you guys will say, "Yeah, I know Jesus was into patting babies on the head and all that, but over
Who says
here,
that?
he's based what?
Who says Jesus was into patting babies on the head?
That's the general sentiment here. That like, yeah, some of the things
I
Jesus
don't
said.
Alfred, I don't know what that means, and I don't know who said it. So instead of going through all the things that you have built up in your head about who we are and what we think, can we just talk about Luke 16:17 or whatever it is you want to talk about instead of trying to rehash all the things you think you've heard before and what you took away from them? What's the issue?
Sure. The issue is that you guys will say, "Well, look, Jesus is condoning all those barbaric laws in the Torah. Every piece of legislation is in full effect," and that's not a good interpretation. It doesn't take into account the history surrounding the Gospels, um, because you're a former Baptist, right?
I am, yes.
You you mentioned that. Well, I'm a Catholic, and frankly, I'll just say it. You can take the boy out of the Baptist church, but you can't take the Baptist church out of the boy. And
Okay,
your
Alfred,
way of
Alfred,
approaching,
Alfred, instead of trying to do some sideways insult to me, as if the Catholics got it right and the Baptists got it wrong, when I'm literally sitting here saying neither of them got it right, as far as I can tell. And you may have your preferred interpretation, but there's no reason for any of us to care what your preferred interpretation is. And until Jesus shows up and tells us what the correct interpretation is, there's no reason for us to pay any more attention to what you say. So instead of trying to joust on a psychoanalysis of whether or not I'm too Baptist to address this when I'm happy to address Catholic claims as the garbage that they are as well. Let's just present whatever you're presenting and find out, do you have good reason for it? Does it matter? Because honestly, even if your interpretation of Luke 16:17, which is not that not a jot or tittle will change, but that generally these portions of the law are going to stay the same, or whatever your interpretation is, I still have no reason to believe that what it says is true in either interpretation, correct?
correct?
So, cool. Do you have some way of showing that your current interpretation is correct and true?
Sure. Well, my interpretation is that basically,
No,
like
no,
for example, Ayn Rand.
Alfred, I just asked a question. What question did I ask you?
You asked, "How can I show that my interpretation is correct?"
Actually, I just said, do you have a way to show that it's correct? And your answer
Oh,
was, my interpretation is. I don't care what your interpretation is until there's reason to think that it's going to be true. So when I ask, do you have a way to show it's true? The answer should be yes, and here it is, or no, and we move on.
yes, and here it is.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. There was an understanding amongst Jews in the time of Jesus, the first century AD, that the Torah was written when we were in a position of power. We no longer have. We can't enforce those laws. We're under Roman occupation, and basically back then it was different strokes for different folks. Nowadays, the basic sentiment of the Torah is what is in effect. It's righteousness, justice. Jesus even says the law and the prophets, all of it is love
Alfred,
your neighbor as yourself.
Alfred, you haven't said a single word about how you can verify that your interpretation is correct. Can you do that? Can you
It's a
give us a
bit,
method? Can you give us the method that confirms that your interpretation is correct?
it's by reading history and,
No,
having a
sir.
conversation with
No,
the authors.
sir. No, sir. No, sir. Do you understand what a method is? Do you understand what evidence is?
That's a condescending question, yes.
Well, it wouldn't be a condescending question if I didn't have to repeatedly ask you for a method. Reading history is not a method to confirm that what the Bible says is true. And
No,
it's
but you
definitely
weren't
not a
asking.
method. It's definitely not a method for determining that your interpretation is correct. What method can I use to determine that your interpretation is correct? Last chance.
I think you're asking two separate questions.
I didn't ask you if you think I'm asking two separate questions. I literally asked one question. What method can we use to determine that your interpretation is correct? That's one question. There's either a method that we can use to determine it or there's not. Which is it?
I mean, I couldn't demonstrate that it's the correct interpretation with certainty.
Then
I'm
why
just
did you
telling
say
you if
then
you
why
know.
did you then why did you claim that you could? If when I asked you, do you have a way to demonstrate that your interpretation is correct? You shouldn't have said yes. If now that we push back on it, you're saying you couldn't.
Okay, well, I don't have a way to demonstrate that Mark thinks Jesus is secretly Satan. That he doesn't think that.
Alfred,
How could I?
Alfred, I didn't ask you about that at all. Now I want to know, why did you claim to have a method and now you're saying you don't?
Well, I have a method. It's just it doesn't attain certainty.
I didn't ask for certainty, did I, Alfred? Did I use the word certainty at all until you did?
I think it's implied. I mean, right?
It's not implied. And if you know what, Alfred, I apologize. I will let Paul see if he can ask you some clarifying question because it's very clear that you and I are not ever going to be on the same page. Because when I ask, do you have a way to confirm that what you're saying is correct? And you say yes. And then I ask you what it is. And all you do is tap dance and whine about how you can't do that. So I'm going to back off and see if Paul can make progress because you and I are never going to make progress, but you and Paul might.
Hi, Alfred. So,
I
if I understood your answer correctly, you were heading toward saying that you use historical method for your validation, and I think we would all agree that historical method doesn't lead to certainty on anything, and that's fine because it's still a valid answer. Am I correct that that is where you were headed?
Yes, you read the saying in its context, and that informs your
Okay.
interpretation.
Okay. So, and that's not exactly
You
the
don't
same as
just read
history,
the
right? Because
Bible like Matt does. Like you just
no,
jump into
oh
the
no, no, no,
Bible
no,
and
no,
read
no,
it,
no, no.
and it's like,
Why
oh,
are you? No, no, Alfred. You and I are supposed to be having a chat, right? Like we're not throwing shade at Baptists or anyone else or Matt or anybody, right?
sorry.
You and I are supposed to have a conversation right now. Cool.
I'm going to interrupt for
You,
one quick. I'm going to interrupt for one quick second. I apologize, Paul. Alfred, I backed out of this to give you the best opportunity. You have no idea how I read the Bible, how I've read the Bible, how I've studied the Bible, or what I know. But if you come at me one more time, even while I'm sitting back here gently, ignoring this so that Paul can have a conversation, I will not only hang up on you, I will ban you from any show I'm ever on. And you probably don't want that. So take my name out of your fucking mouth and continue having a conversation with Paul. Are we clear?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
All right. So Alfred, you just said two different things. You affirmed that historical, but then you said what you do is you read something and you read it in context. I think you would agree that you can read Lord of the Rings in and out of context, right? But that's not historical method. That's just internal critique. So which of the two are you wanting to advocate for here? Are you wanting to advocate for the internal critique of the Bible, or are you advocating that there is external verification or something else?
I'm confused. What do you mean you can read the Lord of the Rings in and out of context?
Oh, I could pull random lines out of the Lord of the Rings, for example, and I try and apply them where they don't
Okay, I got you. No,
where they don't apply.
I mean, read the Gospel of Matthew imagining that I'm in the first century, a Christian Jew
Okay.
reading it. I read the text in the historical context.
Okay. So you want to apply to external, and then you went to something, you said something along the lines of that most of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was written at a time where Judaism was at its height and was at its strongest. And that's actually the opposite of what most scholars think. Most scholars think a lot of it was written during the exile, the huge
That's when it
swaths
was
of it was
redacted.
written. Well, so fair enough, but so not in a position of power, right? It was the lot of it was written when they were at their lows, when they were looking to God to save them. So I guess I'm dubious of your historical method when you get to that. But if we're jumping ahead to
well, dating the Torah is a difficult business. It wasn't written in one go, right? It was written over the course of centuries.
I
think
agree,
the bulk of it was written.
Oh,
sorry.
If you think it was written during a time of power, you are just in conflict with the scholars that I read, right? And so all I'm saying is you're already on a ground that is at very least debatable, right? And now if we go to the Gospels where you're saying you're complaining about the jot and tittle verse and how maybe skeptics do it, I think what you didn't get to because you didn't ask questions were that Matt and I's primary concern is, I won't speak for Matt, I'm going to speak for my concern. My primary concern is why should I think that Jesus even said those words is a question that I care about far more than how you're interpreting them, because I agree that those words were written in the early Jesus movement in around probably by 70 AD or so. Those words were probably, no, actually this is Matthew and Luke, so they would be later, but that's fine. Why should I think that Jesus said those words is more important to me than what are the possible ways that thousands of years of people have interpreted them? Do you understand why that would be the question that someone like me would be asking before I care about your interpretation?
Not really. It feels like a gotcha kind of question, and it's subverting my main point of how I interpret it.
But why, I guess, in general, if I don't think that the Bible reflects the words of Jesus accurately, then debating the interpretation of them is nothing, right? Like it's I'm not going to care. I'm going to tune out. It's not going to affect me in any way. If you're calling to complain about how people who aren't on this call are sloppy about interpretation of the internal critique of Scripture, okay, this isn't really a call-in show to complain about atheists necessarily. This is a call-in show to have you explain to us why we, who are open to it but don't currently believe, should believe. And so you are a couple of steps ahead of where we are. You need to first show us Jesus likely said these words. Do you understand why that's important for someone who doesn't already believe the Bible?
The point is, it's attributed to Jesus. There's no recording of Jesus saying it, okay? And it probably does predate the 70s.
Okay, but do you understand why neither? Well, you understand why I don't care, right? Like you you
You
could
can
bring on
have
a
my
hundred
name in your
different.
mouth whenever you want, Paul.
Okay, all right. Well, you understand why Matt and I don't care about parsing, and I can bring on Christian friends who scholars who would be willing to debate with you about the interpretation of this,
And
and
they
I
would
know that
not
that's an
say,
internal. But you
they would
understand
not
why
interpret it as, sorry.
Matt and I don't care. Like this is the thing. Like until you actually convince me that Jesus said this,
For
I
clarity,
go
for
ahead,
clarity,
please.
just because I'm kind of in on this. So Luke 16:17. If you have a red letter Bible, it's in there in red letters. As Alfred pointed out, it is attributed to Jesus. Whether or not Jesus actually said it matters only to the extent that if Jesus is God and he said it, that would be a slightly different than just Jesus is a random dude and said it. So I'm interested in whether or not Jesus actually said that, but also whether it's true or not, because the statement could be true even if Jesus never said it, but I don't have any way to find out either of those things. I have no way of figuring out whether Jesus actually said it. I have no way of figuring out whether the statement is true and actually reflects the mind or thought of a God in any interpretation. And so this is why we're saying we need a way for you to show that whatever your interpretation is correct, which means if your interpretation accurately maps to the intended true meaning originally inspired by God. And I don't know how you do that, which is why I keep asking.
And if I may add to that, like if someone asked me, did Mark intend for Jesus to be understood as an alien for Mars? How do you know? How do you not know? How do you demonstrate that he didn't intend Jesus to be interpreted as a space alien? I wouldn't know how to do
Because
that either. It's just an
I
honest.
would, I would.
How could
So
you do that?
the burden of proof is on those who would claim that Mark intended to represent Jesus as an alien from Mars. And there's nothing in the passage, nothing in Mark that suggests that Mark was doing that, not explicitly or implicitly. So the people who are claiming that Mark had and intended that interpretation would have to explain why Mark didn't include anything explicitly or implicitly that made that assumption. Until then, the null hypothesis is that there's no connection between Mark's intent and Jesus as an alien until such time as there's evidence for it.
How do you know he's not being cryptic about it and
I'm
not
sorry,
giving it all away at once?
I don't get to say after being presented with here's how you would tell this. Oh, what if he's being cryptic? What if it's a secret message that only certain people get? Congratulations. If you're one of those certain people, then you have a message the rest of us don't have, and it's up to you to demonstrate how that's true. You just took a sound epistemological response to something that you said you didn't know how to do and decided to make up a possibility of bullshit that's called an ad hoc rationalization that there is some secret message. Well, I don't believe in the secret messages. You have to prove that they're there. My response was that until such time as somebody says this portion of Mark is clearly Mark intending to convey Jesus as an alien, then it is unwarranted to believe that Mark was intending that. And you come back with the most, never mind, it's inane.
It's actually not an ad hoc because
It is.
the Gospel of Mark.
It
I'll tell
is.
you why it's not.
No, you're
Because the
not going to tell
Gospel of
me why
Mark.
it's not. You're not going to tell me why it's not because it fucking is. I gave you a methodology. And it doesn't just apply to Mark. That methodology applies to any author making any claim. If you want to say that when I wrote my intro today, that I was intending to convey that Jesus was a fairy that I pulled out of my butt, you have no evidence for that. It clearly, I'll tell you, that was not my intent. And if somebody thinks that was my intent, they have the burden of proof. You don't seem to understand the burden of proof. And your response to being called out on the burden of proof was to say, yeah, well, what if there's a hidden message? Well, what if you actually had good reasoning skills?
Do you think that that's what Matt and I are doing when we say we're unsure that Jesus said these words or that Jesus is divine? Do you think that we are doing some level of ad hoc rationalization?
I don't know. I would just say what I said is not ad hoc because there's a prominent messianic secret motif in Mark's gospel. He's like famous for being cryptic, so I didn't just make that up.
No, there's nothing in there that is cryptic about fucking Mars, is there?
You added the Mars part. I'm just saying he's famous
No,
for the messianic secret.
you fucking liar. I didn't add the Mars part. You said this. All right, I'm going to back off again off of Alfred because I have zero patience for fucking liars. So I'm out. Paul, you can continue to.
Alfred, what was your?
I'm not lying.
was-
I'm not being dishonest.
Okay, then if you're going to keep, you had a chance to not argue with Matt, but you that's where you want to go. So I guess we're done. And
Okay.
Hey,
I mean,
Alfred?
it doesn't sound like you want to talk
Alfred.
to me. So
Alfred, did you say Mars first or did I?
I did.
Yeah. So why did you say you didn't? Why did you blame it on me, you fucking liar? Go away. As if I pulled out. Yes, there are traditions that have Mark and others giving secret messages. Whether or not they're warranted is incredibly in debate amongst scholars. There is a tradition in history. There's an entire separate ending to the Gospel of Mark called the Secret Mark. Mark has additions that don't exist in the oldest and best manuscripts. I have no objection to the idea that maybe there's a message in Mark that is secret. But if your claim is, how do you know Mark didn't secretly or hide a message in portraying Jesus as an alien from Mars? My answer is, believing that is unwarranted until somebody establishes evidence for it. And you don't get to cite secret evidence any more than you get to say you have a girlfriend that goes to another school, so I wouldn't know her. The evidence is you present your girlfriend, not she goes to another school, you wouldn't know her. Oh, when I say what's the evidence that Mark is suggesting that Jesus is a space alien from Mars, and you say, oh, it's a secret, you wouldn't be able to determine it. Your smug dismissal constantly, Alfred, of how Matt just reads the Bible wrong and Matt does this wrong. I'll tell you this. I've been doing this for 20 some odd years, and I used to claim that I didn't have any expertise in anything other than taking complex subjects and making them approachable. But when it comes to someone like you, Alfred, I have expertise in epistemology, skepticism, reason, logic, that at least eclipses yours demonstrably and extraordinarily. And I don't lie. All right.
there's a 25% tariff on Canadian girlfriends now, by the way.
Sweet.